Hi, my name is Dan, and first of all, I'd just like to thank you both for coming along to this very brief lecture on a class that I'm designing called Introduction to Science and Technology Studies. Today, we are going to talk about co-production, which I plan to cover in week 8 at the start of section 3. But in order to give you some context, I'll sort of go over briefly what ideally will have been covered up until this point. So in the second section of the class, we will have covered key theories in science and technology studies. So these 4 theories are basically interested in the processes and the practices through which scientific knowledge and technological development happen. And usually they're in particularly small-scale environments, either within particular laboratories or within the scientific communities. But in general, these theories tend to discuss or conceptualize scientific knowledge as sort of happening within these sort of enclosed spaces. At the start of section 3, and for the rest of it, I intend to cover material which explores the ways in which scientific knowledge and technological development begin to sort of have impacts and be integrated into broader social processes. So for example, the economy, politics, existing legal and regulatory frameworks, existing conceptions of ethics and morality and things like that. So this particular very brief lecture will talk about co-production, which is the concept that I see as sort of framing the rest of this section. But before we sort of go into what co-production is, I think it would be useful to sort of emphasize and reiterate what co-production isn't. So what it's trying to respond against and debunk in terms of the relationship between science and technology on the one hand and society in general on the other. Okay, so one of the things that co-production is trying to push back against is a relationship in which science and technology has a sort of deterministic relationship with society. So what that means is, what people who subscribe to this idea believe, is that the development of particular technologies affects society in sort of a unidirectional way, right? There's no sort of loop back in terms of society affecting technology. What do you think would be problematic about this sort of conceptualization in terms of technology being overly deterministic in terms of how it affects social relations or cultural meanings and identities or things like that? What would be problematic about assuming that technology just unproblematically affects social relations? Yes?
People don't have agency?
Good. They don't have agency. They don't have, they're merely viewed as sort of willing or unwilling, or just like unwilling participants in how technology affects their lives and how they relate to each other and the rest of the world.
Is it also possible that people might not see how society, and how can I phrase this? You know what? I think I'll save this question until the end.
Okay, that's okay. So the first thing that co-production is trying to push back against is a technologically determinist view of technology and society. The second view is sort of the opposite, in which only and purely social relations affect how scientific knowledge gets produced or how technology gets developed. So an example of this could be the current sort of debates and controversy over climate denialism, right? In which the production of knowledge about climate change is viewed as only and purely socially produced, right? There's no external reality out there in which scientists can gather concrete information about, only social relations, and therefore things like political bias or moral concerns affect the way in which societies relate to and produce scientific knowledge and develop technologies, right? So these two things are problematic because they conceptualize a very one-directional understanding of the relationship between science, society and technology. Okay, so co-production, as you can see from the diagram, argues that these two things, these two broad categories, science and technology on the one hand, and social relations and all of the things that comprise that, economics, politics, morality, things like that, they co-constitute each other. And so here's a quote from Sheila Jasanoff, who's one of the key thinkers in co-production, in which she argues that knowledge and its material embodiments, i.e. technologies, are at once products of social work and constitutive of forms of social life. Society cannot function without knowledge any more than knowledge can exist without appropriate social supports. So in this diagram, you can see that society affects science and technology and its development through, for example, providing the context in which scientific knowledge is produced in the first place, right? Scientific knowledge doesn't occur in a vacuum. It occurs in particular societies with particular regulatory frameworks, particular funding structures, and things like that. Yeah? And then on the flip side, the development of particular scientific knowledge and technologies may affect social relations, especially ones which are controversial or groundbreaking or sweeping in their implications for how we relate to each other and the rest of the world. Okay, so let's go through an example about what co-production could mean in practice. Okay, so what is a GMO?
Genetically modified organism.
Awesome. Okay, and do you know what the history of it? When did these sorts of products and start to emerge, and why, and in what context? Yes.
The Green Revolution?
That was in the 1970s, right? Or am I too late for that?
I don't think we know.
Okay, can you give me an example? What is the point of a GMO?
To make food, to enhance some quality of food. So either to enhance its ability to grow in certain conditions, or to have a certain like nutritional quality, or function ecologically in some way.
Mm-hmm.
I remember a specific case study that I took in a class where we focused on rice in China. I can't remember what yeah, that was it. And it was, yeah, and they developed rice that that provided nutrients that improved eyesight, and then, rates of childhood, blindness, dropped drastically.
So in that case, it sounds like they modified a particular crop to be able to produce vitamins or something that would help reduce blindness in children.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So that's good. Awesome. Great stuff. But in general, so GMOs are produced to have a particular trait which is desirable, which may not be naturally occurring. So for example, some of the early GMOs in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s were about pesticides, pesticide resistance. So farmers could plant these GMO pesticide-resistant crops and then use pesticides to get rid of all of the weeds and undesirable plants that happen to grow in the same fields, so that only this particular crop would be grown, right? Or on the flip side, they could be grown because they are improved upon or better than naturally variants of the same crop. So they could grow in more difficult conditions, or grow faster, or perhaps they're larger than the average size, things like that. Yeah? Okay, so, and they emerged in sort of like the 70s and the 80s because the modern biotechnological industry was founded around then. That's when they discovered the technology to be able to edit genes at the molecular scale, right? So, okay, let's do some brainstorming in the last 5 minutes about how social relations or the social context affected the development of GMOs, and then how perhaps controversies or negative side effects of GMOs sort of looped back and affected the way that social relations were structured thereafter. Okay, so the first part of that era. So society affecting GMOs. What happened there? Can we brainstorm and think of some of the things that affected why GMOs emerged in the first place?
The global food system.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that it requires really, really massive yields of
Mhm.
food very consistently, reliably, year after year.
Great. So there is a sort of pressure to feed people on ever larger and increasing scales, and that led to increased funding for scientific research and technological development to occur, in which increased yields could be obtained from crops. Hmm?
Was there a shortage of farmers, since were fewer farmers able to produce more with GMOs? So rather than, you know, needing 20% of the country's population to be farmers, were societies then able to put workers to different kind of jobs with?
Oh, yeah, so I think you might be, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you might be talking about how the sort of emergence of a global, expanded, large-scale agricultural industry restructured labor and employment sort of compositions, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yes, definitely, right? Because if you can develop crops and GMOs that have more predictable, more controllable, more manageable traits, perhaps that's an example of the reverse, right? In which the development of GMOs starts to affect economic labor compositions in particular countries, right? What are some of the negative consequences of GMOs?
Sort of like moral watchback about whether or not they are good to eat or safe medically. So maybe that would affect the kind of knowledge that was produced about health outcomes and also different kinds of labeling, like more organic and GMO and things like this.
I always see, you know, food labels touting, you know, gluten-free or GMO-free, but it's my understanding that, you know, for most people, that's perfectly healthy to eat. So I guess maybe GMOs, kind of like vaccines, they cause, you know, they instill fear in people and cause, you know, unneeded concerns.
So one of the consequences of GMOs in terms of looping back to affect social relations is thinking about, well, what sort of interventions in nature are appropriate, right? And this has some consequences for what we should eat, and how we should modify nature further for our own ends. But also, it starts to question the sort of rigors of science, right? If people are having founded or unfounded concerns about whether or not GMOs are appropriate or safe to eat, that introduces questions about risk, right? How do we evaluate risk? You need new social institutions to evaluate risk, right? New labeling programs and things like that. Okay.